Chapter 1. The Necessity for Biblical Law. According to the rabbinic reckoning, the Torah has 613 laws. In terms of Christian tallies, the number is somewhat less because the ancient rabbinic count sometimes divides a single statement into more than one law. Whichever approach to counting laws is used, a very significant fact emerges. God's purpose is that all of society and all men and nations be governed by His law. Now, the laws of any particular state or nation in our present world order cannot be comprehended in 613 large law books, let alone 613 laws. God obviously does not propose that a nation's laws cover all things nor govern all things. Men bridle at God's law because it legislates against sin. They prefer an order that permits sin and forbids freedom. They see God's law as tyranny because it is a control on sin, whereas they prefer controls on freedom and a license to sin. We have seen what Judge Harold J. Rothwachs has called, and quote, affection for formalism that stabs at the heart of our most precious moral values, end quote. The words justice and righteousness are in the Bible one and the same. In practice today, there is little relationship between them. Such a separation spells the death of a culture. There is another important aspect to God's law, to biblical law. It may seem to a modern lawyer or judge that 613 laws are too few. The truth is even more radical. As we shall see, of the 613 laws, many are not enforceable by man, but only by God. This means that the jurisdictions of church and state are very limited. We have here a godly libertarianism which severely limits the powers of all human agencies. Biblical law seems oppressive only to those who want freedom to sin. God's laws have as their purpose our good. In Deuteronomy 10:13, God orders us through Moses, quote, to keep the commandments of the Lord and His statutes which I command thee this day for thy good. It does not say much for the character of those churchmen who see salvation as freedom from keeping the law. Through Jesus Christ, we are freed from the condemnation of the law, its death penalty, into power to live within the law, now written on the tables of our hearts. Ezekiel 36:25-28, Jeremiah 31:33 and 34. God delivered His law through Moses to the people of Israel, primarily, not to their institutions, except secondarily. It is persons who must keep the law. Since it's for our good, God's law is for us. The perfect law of liberty, James 1:25. If we neglect that law, we neglect our liberty and fall into bondage to state and church. Guilty men are not free men. In our time, placing people under a guilt trip has become commonplace and a form of enslavement. We are guilty if we violate God's law, but we cannot be bound in conscience by man's law. It is expedient that we often obey man-made laws because we are not called to change the world by lawlessness and revolution, but through Jesus Christ. Regeneration, not revolution, must be our way. We must recognize that, as Christians, for us, the first and most basic government is the self-government of the Christian man. Without this, we have nations of slaves. Then, second, the basic governmental institution is the family, man's first sphere of government, his first church and school, his first area of economic knowledge, and so on and on. Third, the church is a government. Fourth, so too is the school. Fifth, our vocation governs us. And sixth, so too does the society we live in, its private and public associations, and so on. Seventh, civil government, the state, One government among many also governs us. God's law provides us with His law for every sphere. It alone can equip us to resist the encroachment of alien powers. It alone empowers the individual person and the family to govern properly. We can't expect our present-day church and state to be favourable to God's law because it denies to them powers they claim and use. There is now a great governmental change underway. With the Christian school and homeschool movements underway, we see more and more families taking back one sphere of government from the state. This represents a major movement against the forces of the Enlightenment and statism. There is also a growing recognition that the source of law is the God of a people or country, and the modern state is the God of the modern age. Sovereignty belongs to God, and He is therefore the only valid source of law. The first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1771, Volume 2, page 862, began its study of law by defining it as, quote, the command of the sovereign power containing a common rule of life for the subjects, end quote. Whose law we acknowledge as our true law is our God and sovereign. Too many churchmen, by denying the validity of God's law, acknowledge thereby that they worship a false God, and they do this shamelessly. They say in effect with Pharaoh, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Exodus 5:2. To obey God means to obey his law, his commandments. W.A. Whitehouse said of the words obey and obedience that in the Hebrew it is to hear. It simply tells us that to hear God is to obey Him. This is also true of the Greek word translated as obey. The contrast to hear and obey is revolt or disobedience. The word is used covenantally. The response to God's covenant of grace and law is properly to hear and obey. Since the law is for our good, it is a personal communication from God to Israel, to a fallen world, and to the church and the nations. There is nothing personal about an act of Congress, Parliament, or any like body. Rather, it is very strictly impersonal and technical. It lends itself to nitpicking and misuse. God's law is the personal word for our good from the totally personal God. We are sometimes told in a revealing phrase that a crime reported to an agency of state sets the machinery of the law to work. This expresses the cold, impersonal operation of man's or the state's law. Not so with God. The Bible speaks of the wrath of God. Nothing could be less impersonal. Sin is a totally personal offence against a totally personal God. Many people simply misunderstand the Bible and try to give less personal meanings to many expressions, and this warps their meaning. For example, God in Numbers 12:14 rejects Moses' attempt to depersonalize Miriam's offence and punishment by stressing the personal offensiveness of Miriam and her sin, saying, quote, if her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed 7 days? Let her be shut out from the camp 7 days, and after that let her be received in again. To depersonalize God is also to depersonalize ourselves. If, as Scripture makes clear, we are to live by what at most can be called 613 laws, then we cannot have a power state nor a power church, because their sphere of relevance is limited to a very few of those 613 laws. It means also that those laws of the 613 which are not reserved by God to his own enforcement, or are given to state and church, are placed in the hands of individuals and families. The Christian must thus be a grace man and a law man. He must manifest both and become their walking manifestation. Grace in the Old Testament is, quote, kindness and graciousness in general, that is, where there is no particular tie or relationship between the persons concerned, Further, it is shown by a superior to an inferior, and there is no obligation on the part of the superior to show this kindness." End quote. This meaning is strongly developed in the New Testament. Grace and law are covenantal. God's covenant is a covenant of grace because for him to enter into a covenant or treaty with man is an act of grace from the superior to the inferior. At the same time, a covenant is a treaty of law whereby, in this case, the greater tells the lesser how to live under his care and protection. To reject God's law is to reject his grace, whereby he gave us his law for our good. To reject or break God's covenant is to invite and be under his judgment, and this we have done. Judgment is both covenantal and personal. God is a person, his law is personal, and so too is his judgment. Since the Enlightenment, men have steadily depersonalized their lives, the world and the universe. Sir Isaac Newton's physics was hailed as a triumph, and Newton as an incomparably great man because he depersonalized the universe. For many deists, Newton also in effect depersonalized whatever God might exist. He was, at best, the great mechanic. Since then, we have depersonalized all of life, including the state. This was easier to do once kings were eliminated and replaced by the mechanics of statecraft in the form of a method of government, not in itself wrong, but deadly in the context of cultural depersonalization. We can know persons, but can we know 613 or 60,013 law books? We can know God who changes not, Malachi 3:6, but can we know the state whose laws or character constantly change? And what is law if it constantly changes at the will of men? If an act of Congress can redefine good and evil, or if courts can legalize abortion, homosexuality and euthanasia, why not rape and murder? If the state defines morality, what happens to good and evil or to truth? We are in the latter stages of the growing decay and collapse of status law. It is time to reconsider God's law. Our freedom depends on it.